Order, order. Paul Scully to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that the e-petition 269157 and 237487 relating to the prorogation of Parliament be considered. If I can just read both petitions into the wording, into Hansard, if I may, the official report. The first one is do not prorogue Parliament. Which says Parliament must not be prorogued or dissolved unless and until the Article 50 period has been sufficiently extended or the UK's intention to withdraw from the EU has been cancelled. The second one, that's actually received 1,721,119 signatures within a very short space of time. There's also one that actually has already closed, the second petition, which says that the Prime Minister should advise Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament. And it goes on to say the Prime Minister should advise Her Majesty the Queen to prorogue Parliament, suspending the current parliamentary session until 2nd of April 2019, clearly out of date now, to prevent any attempts by parliamentarians to thwart Brexit on 29th of March 2019. Preparations for no deal WTO will continue. And it goes on to say the Prime Minister's deal has been rejected, no further deal is available from the EU. Remaining in the EU is not an option. Extension or revocation of Article 50 is not an option. I believe the British people voted to leave with no mention of a deal, and that WTO rules, to which Britain will default on 29th of March 2019, are in Britain's best interests. We may get a better deal after, but not until we have left. Now, clearly, as I said, that second petition is out of date, but one of the reasons that it was been delayed now because events were taking over so quickly at that time, it was very difficult to be able to schedule it in and keep it topical. But naturally, with the prorogation of Parliament upon us tonight, as I believe has been declared, then it was seen suitable to bring the two together, because it's really important that if we can, as a Petitions Committee, we always try and make sure that that we can allow people to have their views aired. Because one of the great things about this system, when we have time in Westminster Hall, and there is a reason why they are some of the most read and watched debates, is because we are talking about what people want us to talk about rather than what we want to talk about. Unfortunately, or fortunately, these two coincide, because we do want to talk about Brexit quite a lot, I've noticed, over the last 3 years. But clearly, because of the topicality of it, because of the fact that the Prime Minister has been really clear that come what may, we're going to be leaving the EU by October the 31st, then people that are looking at that, whether they want to stop no deal or whether they want to stop Brexit in its entirety, they want to express their opinion. Then it's important that we actually discuss that here in the Houses of Parliament and the House of Commons. Now, there is a clear move as to why prorogation is a sensible idea. We have a Prime Minister that was elected by the members of the Conservative Party, and we've had people saying, you know what is he going to be standing for? What is he going to be standing for on a domestic agenda? And so it's right that actually we debate the wider domestic agenda, as well as Brexit, within this place, and that can be done through a Queen's speech, when actually the Prime Minister can set out quite clearly what he wants to do in the coming year of Parliament, this session, the new session, in order to move the debate on, move Parliament on, and the bandwidth of the media away from Brexit as we leave on October the 31st. I'll gladly give way.
I thank my London colleague, for giving way. And could I just ask him, does he believe that it's enough of a mandate to be making such important decisions on the basis of about 100,000 votes from Tory party members?
Well, I'll come back to the ability to have a mandate, because further than that, because clearly one of the things that the Prime Minister is going to be asking you, that are members in, about 5 hours' time, is to vote to have a general election. Clearly that is the best way. First of all, although we've all said that we don't really want a general election this time because we want to get on with the job at hand, but it is at the moment the best way, not only to resolve the conundrum that we face ourselves with at the moment in the lead up to October the 31st, but to be able to move on and show, look, there is a mandate for the domestic agenda. Yeah, I'll gladly give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. As ever, he's doing sterling work in terms of presenting the petition. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we've had numbers mentioned here, 100,000 just a moment ago by the honourable member opposite, 1.1 million on the petition? I have another number for my honourable friend, which is 17,410,742. Does my honourable friend recognise that is the number of people who voted to leave the EU, but due to parliamentary artifice, they're being denied that right?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I couldn't agree with him more. I was indeed one of those 17.4 million people. But I do understand that there are many faceted sides to this argument, that it's a complex argument, but nonetheless, complex arguments, we are charged as members of this place to show political leadership. And we've had 3 years now when we've talked about what we don't want. We've ummed and ahed, we've had political shenanigans, we've had games afoot, and the last few months, especially since the it seems a long time since the summer recess, but the last few weeks seems to have been like trash talk in a press conference ahead of a heavyweight boxing match when people are trying to win the fight without throwing a punch before the first punch is thrown. Clearly now, what people are expecting us to do is to get on with the job, to actually leave the EU, to with or without a deal, to then be able to say, you know what, we should now be talking about how we're leaving, not whether we're leaving. The fact that we are still talking about whether we're leaving after 3 years since the referendum demonstrates exactly the point my honourable friend was making, and saying that actually we cannot pick and choose the votes, the elections that we want to uphold. 17.4 million people, the most people to have voted for anything in a British election, have charged us to leave the EU. I'm glad to give way.
Isn't it the case that we need to know whether we're leaving with a deal or without a deal to actually adequately know what legislation we require? How can we have a Queen's speech on the 14th of October before the European Council and to frame the legislation we need when we don't know whether we're leaving with a deal or no deal, in your own framing?
Well, actually, to be fair, I mean, with the last few interventions, I've allowed myself to be distracted from the fact that actually key thing for the Queen's speech is to actually demonstrate the domestic agenda. It is to talk about the 20,000 new police officers. It is to talk about making sure that people can see the benefits from frontline funding in the NHS. It is about levelling up funding for schools and a full fibre broadband across the country. But what we do know, as we are ramping up preparation for no deal, we know exactly the kind of thing that we're going to need should we get a deal, although the deal that we're likely to get, if we get there, is going to be substantively different from the last withdrawal agreement. But similarly, there is legislation that we've been trying to put through this place in terms of no deal preparations over the last few months. And actually, again, I'm allowing myself to be distracted because we keep talking about deal or no deal, whereas actually what this is a withdrawal agreement. The deal is yet to come. The deal, in terms of trade deals, as we use that word interchangeably, is all about the future relationship with the EU. And we haven't even got there yet. All we're talking about, I say all in inverted commas, because of course it's complicated and it's still significant, is how we are actually physically leaving the EU. And then what that relationship, that trading relationship, is going to look like, then that's going to take time to come. And the reason that that has happened is one of the fundamental concerns that I've had, albeit from 2.5 years ago, but I can't revisit what we did 2.5 years ago. And that was accepting the sequencing that Michel Barnier and the EU put towards us, that we had to get the divorce, if you like, done before we could talk about the future relationship. It would have been far more sensible, and it was that formed the basis of the Vote Leave campaign, was to be able to do the two at the same time, to be able to talk about, because we can talk about the backstop, for example. It would be far easier, instead of coming up with a convoluted system that just has failed to get through this place so many times, if we knew the trading relationship that we were going to end up between the Northern Ireland in particular and the Republic of Ireland, then we would have been able to be working on those solutions, those alternative arrangements, not just now, not just in the last year, but the last 3 years. And that would have been a far better, more holistic approach to actually be able to leave. But I think it is I will give way.
Very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I agree with him that the public are keen for us to move on to the domestic agenda. But isn't it the case that we're really talking about either having Queen's speech in October or having one in November after Brexit has taken place, given the Prime Minister's determination to do so on the 31st of October. And as he says, one of the ways in which we may leave may be with no deal. And I agree with him that it would not be desirable or possible to take that off the table at this point. But if that's true, don't we as Parliament have an obligation to scrutinise the government's no-deal preparations? And shouldn't we be spending the 5 weeks during which we might be prorogued doing that instead of anything else, including party conferences?
I thank my right honourable friend for his intervention. And he has a point in theory, but unfortunately it is theory, because we've already cancelled 2 recesses and delayed 2 recesses, which, you know, to the angst of a number of members. And what have we been doing during those recesses? Actually, what we were doing was having SIs on the floor, statutory instruments on the floor of the House, because there was not enough coming forward from the opposition to actually talk about Brexit. I remember walking around in this place, seeing members of the opposition with their coats on, leaving early. So if they actually wanted to get involved in debates, if they wanted to add to the 500 or so hours of debate that we've already had in this place about Brexit, then they could have done those in those 2 weeks. And frankly, they could have actually started to cancel summer recess. But clearly, that was a little bit too inconvenient. So I'll give way and then I'll come.
Well, my friend, is actually inadvertently, if you realise, is actually making a case for a Queen's speech, because the realities are that government has been splitting up bills basically in order to ensure that parliamentary time is used up, rather than actually what we really need, which is a new agenda and a new raft of legislation to put before the House, so actually people can have their confidence restored in this Parliament by actually seeing it doing something, rather than, frankly, just arguing and frustrating over Brexit.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. You know, we already have this odd addition of this fortnight that we have now, and coupled with that 5 week, it just really smacks of look busy, the boss is watching. It's actually scratching around trying to find something to do. Now, I do not dismiss the fact that actually the scrutiny of any actions of the government and any legislation that comes through and action is really important. But I just caution the fact that actions need to match words. I'll give way.
I thank you for giving way. And I've never known a parliament where the business has collapsed so often, so regularly. And yet we've got the agriculture bill, the fisheries bill, the trade bill, all of which needed to come back on report, then third reading and go to the Lords. Where are they? Why haven't they come back? Why didn't we use the time properly? This is quite disgraceful.
Yeah.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. Look, in terms of disgraceful, I must admit, you know, this has been I've only been in this place for 4 years now. 3 of those years have been, quite frankly, me scratching my head, sitting there thinking I've got some of the most intelligent people around me acting in the most stupid way possible, and I blame both sides of the argument equal. I'm an equal opportunity critic in that regard, because, as I say, we should now be talking about whether we leave, not or how we leave, not whether we leave, as I was saying earlier. This is clearly, it's a big issue. It creates divides across parties, across communities, across families. But nonetheless, actually, we were charged with a relatively simple question. Do we leave? Do we remain? And leave one. And it's not beyond the wit of man to actually give business and communities and EU nationals here and British citizens abroad that sense of certainty that they need, that they deserve. And so I just hope that in the weeks to come that we will be able to move on and get a resolution, and then get back to the domestic agenda that will be set out in the Queen's speech on the 14th of October. We saw a lot of, as the Leader of the House described it, confected outrage when it was first discussed about proroguing Parliament. And people were conflating 2 different sets of statements, because what a number of the Conservative leadership candidates were talking about when they said it would not be good to prorogue Parliament to stop no deal, to stop or create Brexit, come what may. They were talking about proroguing Parliament to straddle October the 31st so that we would fall out without discussion. And that's clearly not what's happening here. So this hashtag coming across on Twitter, on social media, stop the coup, started to arise. Well, frankly, that would be the worst coup ever. Because, you know, we have a situation when we're coming back on the 14th of October. We're going to be debating the Queen's speech for the following week, in which no doubt will involve Brexit debates within that as well, because clearly that's going to be a major part of the Queen's speech. But then we've got weeks afterwards, because the Brexit will only come back if we get a deal on the 18th of October, the end of the EU Council. So that's the point when we need to be discussing any deal that hopefully we can achieve and start to bring back to this place, and then have something that we can all circle around and say, you know what, nobody gets everything they want, but this is enough to respect the referendum and to then start looking at the opportunities that Brexit offers rather than whether we're leaving on. Give way.
I'm very honourable member giving way. We've got a national crisis at the moment. This isn't business as normal. The reality is we as elected parliamentarians should be in this House debating all the crucial issues relating to Brexit, not least what the government's meant to be coming up with a solution to the Northern Ireland backstop, of which at the moment it's looking more like the Emperor's new clothes. So surely his arguments are weak today in saying that we're going to use this facade of a Queen's speech and put a new parliamentary agenda forward. At the same time, we've got this big cloud of Brexit over our heads.
I thank Right Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I would agree with her that this is a political crisis. This is something that's grinding the country to a halt. It's certainly grinding them to boredom, frankly. But nonetheless, there is one way, as I say, about sorting this out. We can either sit here contemplating our own navels in this place, or we can go out and speak to the people. We can then have a general election when we can discuss both Brexit, we can talk about the general election, and we can actually engage 70 million people, not just 650. How about that? That's to me, that's democracy in action. Now, a number of you might say, a number of members might say that, I tell you what, let's have a second referendum. Now, there is an issue with that, clearly, because the first one took 9 months, I think, to get through this place and actually hold. There would be a number of issues, not least the question, not least the electorate, and these kind of things that would be hotly debated in this place before we can even get there. So those people that were saying, first of all, this is creating uncertainty, well, that is perpetuating uncertainty. If people were saying that the EU referendum caused division, I'll tell you what, let's have another one. I'll happily give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Does he agree with me that there is a new argument that's gone forward when a number of parties have said that if there is a second referendum, they will only honour it if it votes in one particular way? That completely undermines not just the potential of that referendum, but all referendums in the future. Does he agree?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that intervention, and he has argued passionately in this place, alongside me, against the need for a second referendum, and I do agree with everything he said, how it undermines the position. I was talking about stopping the coup, the hashtag Stop the Coup, and how bad a coup it would be if the prorogation of Parliament was seen to be one. But instead, what do we see? We see games, parliamentary games, played by the other side of the argument. So we have the fact that the Ben bill has come through with the House having taken control, Parliament having taken control away from the government at parliamentary time, down to an amendment from the Speaker, who was effectively making it up as he went along. And my discussion with the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield said to me in a discussion that I had with him that he didn't even expect that amendment to go through, that allowed him the ability to first lay the path for Parliament to take away the order of business from the government.
On the question of the referendum, I'm very grateful for giving way. On the question of the referendum, is this concerned similarly with a confirmatory referendum, where actually the empowerment is then to the people, as was used in the Good Friday Agreement, to show the people's acquiescence to a result which would become law? So therefore, members in this place who seek to disagree with it our 650, 351 vote amongst the entire electorate?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I'll just come back to the point that any referendum, confirmatory or otherwise, is actually does take time, and it's just so we are trying to leave so that we can get onto the next stage of the debate that we've had we've had for 3 years now, and so I'm not entirely sure that that would resolve anything, although it is a step up from the so-called people's vote, which we've already, frankly, had a people's vote, but the second people's vote, if you like, I'll happily give one.
There's also a perverse situation that arises from having a confirmatory referendum, and that's the fact that that almost predicates that you'll get a very bad deal, because they know they're giving you a bad deal, therefore people will vote therefore not to accept that deal. So it really is, frankly, it's Hobson's choice.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely correct, as he always is. The fact is that, as I say, every time you take away, you diminish the negotiating point from a position from this government, you will inevitably have the distinct possibility of a watered-down deal. In fact, why does the EU need to speak to us at this moment in time anyway? Because the way that the Benn Bill actually theoretically works is that the letter that Parliament has written for this Prime Minister to take to the EU allows the EU the ability to dictate the date that the UK leaves the EU. Now, it's called a surrender bill. It's been nicknamed a surrender bill for a reason, because that's about as surrendery, if that's a new word, as it gets, frankly. But I come back to the point. I'll conclude my remarks now.
Before my honourable friend does, to give way one more time.
I'll give way.
Very grateful to him for giving way. He's been very generous. And again, I agree with him that it would be wrong to postpone our departure from the EU beyond the 31st of October. But if that's the case, then we either leave with a deal or with no deal. If we don't have a general election, we'll know by the end of this evening whether we're to have one or not. We will then prorogue in the absence of a general election. Isn't the point, though, that we will come back on the 14th of October and give ourselves 2 weeks either to analyse a new deal or pass the old one, or to decide how we prepare ourselves best and how the government will prepare us for no deal. And that's simply not enough time.
I thank my right honourable friend for his intervention, and I think we have discussed no deal over the last few months to quite an extent. Now, there will clearly be the more specifics if that's looking how it's going to go, clearly. So I think rather than not having enough time, it will be people probably moving a bit more pace, a bit more frantically, because the problem is in this area, and I've never voted to take no deal off the table, because I think it's a serious proposition, and I've always wanted to get a deal, but I'm prepared to leave with no deal if we've done everything we can to get there. But too many people in this place have just dismissed it, and this goes right the way back to the heart of the referendum, when actually nobody has taken or not enough people, should I say, have taken seriously what people charged us to do. The number of times I've had people pat me on the head and explain to me why I voted to leave, rather than asking me. And I know that's me as a Member of Parliament. You imagine someone from Joe Public from around anywhere in the country that voted to leave, how patronised they are by the establishment. And so no deal has always been there, whether it's been taken seriously or not by members of the government at various points. That's an argument for another day, possibly. But it's absolutely should have been a serious proposition. It should have been discussed as a serious proposition. It should have been scrutinised as a serious proposition over the last 3 years. And we're now at the point that has ramped up. And I do believe that it'll be there will be plenty of time to debate that. But I do hope that we get that deal. I do hope that by having the ability to say we are going to be leaving by the 31st of October, that actually does focus minds of all of us to make sure that we can get rid of the backstop, which is the only thing. Bear in mind, that's the only thing that has passed this place in order to affirmatively, positively, rather than telling us what we don't want to do. But in conclusion, I come back to the point that proroguing to the 14th of October to have a Queen's speech allows the new Prime Minister to set out his bold, ambitious, domestic vision for this country. And that's absolutely what people are screaming out for. They want us to get Brexit done so they can talk about what affects them on a day-to-day basis. That's their hospital, their children's schools, the safety of them around their homes on the streets by having more policemen, by having infrastructure, whether it's rail, whether it's broadband, all of these things. That's what affects people on a day-to-day basis when they walk out the door of their homes. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 269157 and 237487 relating to the prorogation of Parliament. Helen Hayes.
Thank you very much, Mrs Ryan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I rise to speak on behalf of the 8,738 residents in Dulwich and West Norwood who signed the petition in opposition to prorogation, the 8th highest proportion of constituents in any constituency in the country, and on behalf of all my constituents who will be denied their voice and democratic representation as a result of prorogation today. The argument has been made that this prorogation is normal ahead of a Queen's speech, that only 3 days of parliamentary time are being lost, that we would normally break for conference recess anyway. But we are not in ordinary times. Brexit has riven our country. We know that the government's own analysis shows that there is no version of Brexit which does not inflict damage on the UK economy, but also that a no-deal Brexit will deliver a calamity for jobs, for the supply of medicine and food, and for peace in Northern Ireland. A no-deal Brexit poses a catastrophic threat to so many of the things that our constituents hold dear and on which they depend. To prorogue Parliament at such a time is not normal business. It is an outrage to our democracy. My constituents voted overwhelmingly, 77%, to remain in the European Union. I represent one of the most diverse constituencies in the country. We are internationalist. We celebrate diversity. Our values are European values. That strength of feeling in my constituency of Dulwich and West Norwood has not diminished since 2016. It has strengthened and it has deepened. Yet since June 2016, 77% of my constituents and 48% of voters across the country have been told that we must be quiet, that our views no longer matter. We have been told, even in the face of evidence that Vote Leave broke the law to an extent that may have been sufficient to influence the result of the referendum, that we must be quiet. We have been told that we must be silent in the face of evidence of the impact of Brexit, which were not ever discussed during the referendum campaign, most notably the impact on the Good Friday Agreement and on peace in Northern Ireland. And we have been told to be silent as the definition of Brexit, which was not discussed or defined during the 2016 referendum, has become ever more reckless, more right-wing and more extreme. But, Mrs Ryan, that is not how democracy works. It is not ever the case that when we vote in this country, in a referendum or in a general election, that those who were on the losing side in that vote must simply change their views and acquiesce to those who won. It is not ever the case when we vote in an election in this country that everyone's views are static from that point on forevermore. And it is always the case in our democracy that discussion and debate in an orderly fashion in this Parliament continue, and that is how we resolve our differences, and that we reflect on the result of that vote, the consequences of it and its impacts, and on what should happen next. To shut down debate at this time, when this House had not voted on the dates of conference recess, when extensive representations had been made to the Prime Minister over the summer that Parliament should be recalled. To shut down that debate is an insult to my constituents and an outrage to our democracy. And the Honourable Member opposite spoke of the times in this House when business has finished early, when we have not had matters to debate before us. I say to him, the Prime Minister has not brought any solutions to Brexit to this House for discussion and debate. He wants to close down debate in this place to force through a reckless no-deal Brexit which will inflict harm on constituents across this country. That is irresponsible. It will drive division through our country even more. And we must, in our democracy, have the opportunity always. I give way.
I'm very, very grateful to her, and as she knows, I agree with the thrust of her argument that we should spend the bulk of the 5 weeks of possible prorogation we're talking about here discussing these issues rather than elsewhere. But wouldn't it be better if we made clear on both sides of the chamber that we would use that time to discuss, as my honourable friend said in opening this debate, the best way for us to leave the European Union rather than refight the referendum campaign, as I fear she may be suggesting we should do? Isn't the best way of proceeding for us to leave with a deal and to forge what consensus we can across party to find a deal we can all agree on?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. My constituents don't want to leave the European Union, and that is clear. And as a backbench MP on the opposition benches, I reserve the right to represent their views and to test with them how they feel and think about any deal that is on the table. But we have had a deal from the previous Prime Minister which was undeliverable in this House for a range of different reasons on both sides of the House. And we now have a Prime Minister who says he wants a deal, but who won't put a deal on the table or negotiate in good faith with the European Union on a deal. And in that context, I am not prepared to acquiesce to an emperor's new clothes argument that this will somehow be fine for my constituents. And I want the right to continue to represent their views, to continue to bring to this House in an orderly fashion their views and their concerns, and to debate those with the government, and to hold this reckless Prime Minister to account. So I say by way of closing, Mrs Ryan, I will not be silent on behalf of my constituents. Their voices will continue to be heard. Our values will continue to be represented in this debate. And I urge colleagues on all sides of the House to continue to vigorously oppose this prorogation and to remain sitting this evening. This cuts to the very heart of our democracy, the ability of members of Parliament to hold the executive to account. And we have an executive that seems determined recklessly to drive us over the edge of a cliff. And we cannot stand for this.
Christian Madders.
See you in the chair for this very important debate, and can I just thank my honourable friend for her excellent contribution there. I thought she spoke a great deal since. I think we're probably in disagreement about some of the eventual outcomes, but her defence of democracy was absolutely first class, and I wholeheartedly support that. And can I just also refer to the opening remarks from the honourable member for Sutton and Cheam? He talked about a lot of issues. I think one area I'd say I regret hearing from him was that we shouldn't be here contemplating our navels, and that's certainly not something that I do when I'm here. And no honourable member I'm aware of spends their time here doing that. They're here representing their constituents, doing the very best for them. And I think it would be wrong to suggest to the public at large that our time here is not absolutely important and normally well spent. So I speak on this petition because many of my constituents have also signed the petition to block prorogation. More than 10 times as many have added their names to the petition against prorogation as have signed it to support the implementation of it. And I suspect the number who are concerned about events will continue to rise. And of course, many constituents have contacted me through social media and email. And I agree with them because, as we've heard, for the Prime Minister to shut down Parliament at such an important time in our country's history, in the end stages of the Brexit process, with by far the largest negotiations this country has undertaken in at least half a century, is nothing short of an outrage. Not content with ignoring Parliament, we know the Prime Minister actually ignores his own cabinet colleagues as well. The actual number of people who were consulted about this decision before it was made was small. Most cabinet members were not consulted, and actually it's no wonder that they weren't consulted when many of them spoke very strongly against prorogation during the Tory leadership campaign. For example, the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove said, "You don't deliver on democracy by trashing democracy." The Right Honourable Member for South West Norfolk said the idea was an archaic manoeuvre. And the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath said, "I think it will be wrong for many reasons. I think it would not be true to the best traditions of British democracy." So I agree with what they've said, even if they do not agree with themselves anymore. But I certainly will.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I want to know if he will acknowledge that all three of those quotes that he's just been given were in direct response to proroguing Parliament across bridging on October 31st to take the prorogation beyond the date that we're supposed to leave the EU.
I don't know the precise context of the comments that were made, but what is also clear is that this prorogation is actually designed to have the same effect, which is actually to shut down debate, stop Parliament actually analysing properly the effects of our exiting the EU by way of a deal or not. And I'm afraid it amounts to the same thing, which is an absolute outrage for democracy. But that is where we are. Parliament's going to be suspended later today because of the Prime Minister's desire to avoid scrutiny and force us into a no-deal Brexit, despite the government's own analysis showing that a no-deal Brexit will mean food shortages, medicine shortages and chaos at our ports. And this is despite Parliament itself legislating to take no deal off the table and the government having no mandate from the British people to leave the EU without a deal. But what else would we expect from this Prime Minister? Having heard reports last week that his Chief of Staff had described negotiations as a scam and an attempt to run down the clock. Even the Right Honourable Member for Hastings has decided that she can no longer take part in this charade and that her resignation from the Cabinet this weekend was because the government had not undertaken serious formal negotiations with the EU, and I think that exposes the truth of what this government is about. So let us be absolutely frank about that. This government is about hiding from scrutiny. It is about running away from the reality and the consequences of the decisions being made by this government. It's a desperate attempt to cut and run before the truth catches up with them. I have had a string of local companies come to see me over the summer with real, genuine concerns about the impact of a no-deal Brexit. Between them, they employ thousands of people, and decisions being made by this government now have the potential to wreak havoc on the local economy. And it's not just about the consequences of leaving without a deal, but decisions related to that that are being made by this government that could actually be changed. They're industry-wide issues, and that will almost certainly mean jobs in other parts of the country will also be affected. But we are denied the opportunity to hold this government to account on these matters because we know the truth is that they cannot justify the decisions that they are making. We are in the middle of the biggest constitutional crisis this country has ever seen. We're on the cusp of enacting the biggest changes this country has made for a generation, and yet the government are acting as if there is nothing to talk about. What an outrage. If we do leave the EU on the 31st of October, with or without a deal, we are woefully underprepared in either scenario. It is simply inconceivable that all the legislation needed for an orderly exit is in place. As referred to from my honourable friend, the member for Stroud, earlier on. To my knowledge, there are at least 6 bills that haven't been passed that would need to be enacted into law for that to happen. And if we do crash out on the 31st without a deal, what the Prime Minister, which despite what the Prime Minister says is actually still an option, let's not forget that, and that's if he can persuade Parliament that that is the right thing to do. There's still an enormous amount of contingency planning needed in transports, medicines and foods, to name but a few, where members of Parliament should actually be scrutinising government and holding them to account for what they intend to do. In fact, Ms Ryan, I read a very alarming report the other day suggesting that part of the plans for a no-deal Brexit involved relocating thousands of council staff from around the country down to Whitehall to deal with no-deal fallout. And then, bizarrely, the council staff will be replaced by members of the armed forces. Now, I've no idea if it's true, and I hope it isn't, but surely we deserve to know what is going on. Surely our role as parliamentarians, we should be scrutinising government policies, particularly when the effect might be as dramatic as that. We should be sitting here every day until 31st of October to sort this out. That's what we've been elected to do. The Prime Minister should not be going around the country electioneering at a time of national crisis. It is snollygostering of the highest order. And the Prime Minister's game, because that's what it is to him, has been clear for some time. get a load of spending announcements out quickly, shut down any scrutiny of them, and hope that the traditional honeymoon period that all Prime Ministers have lasts until the middle of October. Well, we're not going to play that game. And I've been on to him since his second day in office when he announced a £3.6 billion fund for towns. And when I heard about that, I thought that sounds pretty promising and certainly something that Ellesmere Port and Neston could benefit on. So I was keen to see if my constituency would be on the list. But because Parliament wasn't sitting, I decided to put in an FOI. I sent that to the Cabinet Office, and when they responded, they said they had no information at all. So here we have a Prime Minister announcing a multi-billion-pound expenditure, and his office doesn't even have one scrap of paper setting out how it will be spent. What a complete charlatan. I want accountability, I want answers, and I want a minister at the dispatch box explaining where money is going, how it is being spent, and who decided where it's going. Anything less than that, it looks like a political fix, a cheap stunt unworthy of a serious party of government. And it's not just that issue, which I want answers on. We have a major employer in my constituency talking about shutting down in a no-deal Brexit. We have 2 secondary schools up in arms about the way they've been treated. We have major concerns about the way a company contracted by the NHS suddenly went bust over the summer, issues with the future of the fire service, major problems with access to mental health services, rising unemployment and a chronic lack of affordable housing, all of which we should be tackling here in Parliament now. But the truth is that we're not going to be able to talk about those things because the Prime Minister doesn't want scrutiny because what he says does not stand up to it. He tells us he cannot negotiate with the EU if no deal is taken off the table, but given he claims the primary change he wants to make is on the Irish backstop, which is a very specific issue, I see there is no connection between the changes he says he wants and the need to keep no deal on the table. He's also told us the first thing the EU will ask in respect of any proposals made by the government is whether they have the support of Parliament. But how can Parliament say it will support these proposals if it doesn't even know what they are and it's not sitting to find out? It doesn't stack up. It is a nonsense. And it is unravelled within a matter of days of Parliament returning. No wonder he doesn't want it to be sitting. The more exposure he gets, the more even his own party walk away from the circus. The clown's routine is an insult to the office of Prime Minister, to Parliament and to the people of this country who he thinks are going to be duped by Eton's answer to Arthur Daly. We're not going to fall for it. You cannot claim, as the Conservative Party have, to believe in parliamentary sovereignty on the one hand and shut it down on the other. So I want to put on the record that I do not support prorogation of Parliament, and I believe it to be an unprecedented, anti-democratic and unconstitutional attack on our democracy. Taking back control means this Parliament taking back control. I mean standing up to the bully boys who want to shut us down.
Faisal Rashid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan. It's great to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my honourable friend from Ellesmere and Neston, who was making an excellent case. I must say, Mrs. Ryan, the prorogation of Parliament is just the latest in a series of reckless and opportunistic gambles undertaken by Conservative Prime Ministers over the issue of Europe. As always, it is the hard-working people of this country who will suffer most as a result. David Cameron refused to face the consequences of his own decision to hold an in-out referendum on Europe in 2016 without any conditions at all. Theresa May argued that no deal was better than a bad deal, and after bringing a bad deal to back Parliament, we are now unsurprisingly faced with crashing out without a deal. This outcome was not even part of the discussion in 2016. Yet nothing else now will satisfy this government's far-right backers. In the last few years, poverty, inequality, homelessness has been on the rise. Against this backdrop, Parliament has been reduced to endlessly banging on about Europe. As the Prime Minister suspends Parliament to take us out of the Europe without a deal, experts and the government's own advisers warn of food shortages and limited access to medical supplies. Just stop and think about that for a second. Peacetime shortages of food and medicines. They are not the result of a natural disaster, but a political disaster, the Conservative Party. The damage of a no-deal Brexit will not be temporary. It threatens profound systematic damage to our economy. The Bank of England says that this outcome will permanently, not temporarily, permanently reduce the UK's export potential. The Treasury believes that it will result in an economy 8% to 10% smaller in 15 years. And mostly, it's the Northwest who will hit the hardest. And time that when, if we remain within the European Union, the President of the National Farmers Union, Minat Batters, he said that it would be socially and economically catastrophic for farming in Britain. Make UK the manufacturers' organisation. He said that it would be disastrous for the majority of UK manufacturers and the livelihoods of the millions of people they employ and their families. Yet to realise this disaster outcome, the government has resolved to gag Parliament in these most critical days for our country. That they can proceed with such an arrogance is astonishing. But after all, it won't be their families on the breadline. It won't be their livelihoods destroyed. We need to prevent the irreparable damage of a no deal at all costs. The single greatest myth of a no-deal Brexit is the idea that it will avoid the need for negotiations with the European Union. The day after we crash out without a deal, the need for a strategic relationship with our largest and nearest market will remain, and we will be seeking for a free trade agreement after crashing out. The government talks about strengthening our negotiating position with the EU. The reality is that the day after no deal, we will be forced to go cap in hand to the EU for a trade deal. With our economy in tatters, how will we negotiate then? You know, when you say about, we have to keep no deal on the table in order to negotiate, once we get out without a deal, how can we expect a good free trade agreement at that point? MPs from across the House must fight to stop no deal with all our might. That is why I will be voting against a general election this evening until the threat of leaving without a deal is ruled out. Otherwise, we are up for general election and we are ready for it. Thank you.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for calling me. I think this is a really important debate, not least because 1.7 million people signed this petition, and we've had demonstrations up and down the country, including in Leeds, both this Saturday and the previous Saturday. The previous Saturday was the largest demonstration in Leeds since the Iraq War, with 5,000 people turning out to hear some of the cities and some of our region's MPs, all from the party on this side of the House. And it's because people think that we need to be here in Parliament scrutinising the executive at this crucial time and not having 5 weeks of us being back in our constituencies or at party conferences or, as has been said by my honourable friend from Ellesmere Port, the Prime Minister electioneering, using public money for electioneering in that period before the rules that can come in under a general election to suspend that spending take place. And it's vitally important that we're here because the country is in no way prepared for the 31st of October if the Prime Minister crashes out of the EU, as seemingly is his intent. Today I read in the Times that our EU negotiating team is just 4 people. How will 4 people negotiate a new withdrawal agreement with the European Union in the time that we have before the European Council? It doesn't seem credible. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and that is why the Parliament is being prorogued, so that scrutiny does not exist. And what else do we need in that period? There are a number of bills that have started their process through the House that have not been completed, that need to be completed before we reach any watershed moment with the European Union. And if they're not completed, it will be absolutely chaotic. We will live in a chaotic country where international laws aren't properly legislated for in our legislature and cannot be enacted. So we have the trade bill. The trade bill has not finished its completion. And why is it not? Because it should have done. It should have done. Really, we were on track to finish the trade bill in May of this year, I think. I don't mind if the Minister corrects me on that, but I think we should have completed the trade bill in May of this year. It's because there are attempts, which I would have supported, to insert customs union into that trade bill. But the government, both of this Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister, the right member for Maidenhead, didn't want a customs union inserted into that bill. So the bill was slowed down. So we're not going to complete a trade bill in time for the 31st of October. And an immigration bill which would have completed some surety, or perhaps not, depending what happened with that bill, for EU citizens in this country and to regulate immigration post-Brexit. But so what happens to those EU citizens if the Prime Minister doesn't negotiate a withdrawal agreement and we leave with no deal on the 31st of October? I hope the Minister has got a good answer for that, because I know there's 3 million people in this country who are very interested to know what their status is going to be without the completion of that immigration bill. And I don't think they believe the promises that come from ministers and the executive. And what about the fisheries bill? One of the main, centre pieces of the Leave campaign, 2016, was that the UK would take back control of fisheries and fishing rights. But how is that going to be possible without a fisheries bill? Aren't other countries that share our territorial waters going to contest us without that legislation in international courts? What a laughingstock we'll be if we leave 31st October without that legislation being completed. And an agricultural bill. An agricultural bill that is meant to frame what we're going to have post the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, I'm sure the Minister will stand up and say, all these bills will be in the Queen's speech. Obviously, he can't decide now, and he can't give us a decisive answer on what will be and what won't be in the Queen's speech. But he'll try and give us some reassurances. But I want to know how we're going to legislate all those bills by the time we get to the 31st of October. Yeah.
My friend give way. Is he aware, because I certainly am not, of whether any carryover motions have been pressed to save these bills, to avoid the necessity of them having to appear in the Queen's speech, and mean that we could get back onto it in the ridiculously short time we will have left?
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my honourable friend from East Lothian for raising that point. We only have a few hours, do we not, before the House is prorogued. So I'm sure that the colleagues of the Minister are busily preparing to ensure that we do not have to bring those bills back in the Queen's speech. But one bill that, without doubt, we would need in the Queen's speech is an environment bill. Because we were expecting an environment bill to be laid. We were expecting to be through first and second read, to be in committee stage. I wanted to be on the committee. I'm sure my honourable friend from Cardiff North, who sat next to me, wanted to be on that committee as well. But we have no environment bill. And I'd like to know what regulations and how we're going to enforce them are going to exist on the 1st of November if the Prime Minister completes the task that he has set for himself. In Leeds, we are due to have a clean air zone. Air quality is some of the worst in this country. The government was taken to court 3 times by Climate Earth on the basis of EU regulations which form part of UK law, and lost, to enshrine and embed and widen air quality through a number of other local authorities in the UK. And the government have actually failed to deliver to Leeds what it needs in terms of a charging system and equipment for those vehicles. So we are going to be in breach of EU regulations on air quality in Leeds for a longer period than we expected. Who is going to provide the environmental protection we need? I asked the then Minister, she's now the Secretary of State for Department for Work and Pensions, but just a few hours ago she was Minister of State in Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And I asked her the question about environmental protection. She said that in a no-deal Brexit scenario, the new agency will not be formed until the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. And that people have to retrospectively take environment action. So that means that we will have no environment protections country from the 31st of October until that date. I've got currently an issue of effluent discharge in the River Wharfe. I'd hope for some enforcement action on this. Am I going to have to be disappointed if people are going to have to swim in effluent for 2 more years because there is no regulation? I'd like to know. These are not small, minor issues. These are huge, huge issues. And Parliament should be here, sitting and debating these bills and scrutinising them, being in committee and getting them through. So on 31st October, we are not in a situation where the people of this country are going to have far, far worse quality of life.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Rachel
I'm really
Maskell.
grateful to the speech that my honourable friend has made. There are also many factors which are so important. On the 5th of August, we saw clearly the incursion in Kashmir, and my constituents want to debate that issue and to call the government to account over the actions that it's taking in the light of the lockdown that there has been in Kashmir and the sheer catastrophic humanitarian risk in Indian-administered Kashmir. Surely proroguing Parliament is also preventing this House scrutinising the government's action on really important global matters too.
My honourable friend from York Central is absolutely right. We have the issue in Kashmir where the internet's been shut down, there's a lack of reporting, there's a crackdown by the Indian government. We have the events in Hong Kong, where actually Britain is a party to the Chinese-British agreement in 1984. So it isn't really, in some sense, a matter of foreign policy, but equally it's not what happens in Hong Kong. We won't be able to have any scrutiny over the Foreign Secretary on that matter either. There are a whole raft of things over and above legislation, and all that people will have to see in that period are the party conferences. So there'll be one party's view being given. Obviously, in the week of the 20th September will be my party's view, and I'll support the fact that we get one time a year we get a fair hearing in the media and a platform. But it's not the same as the parliamentary scrutiny that we'd have if we were here. I'd just like to conclude, actually, and I think it's complementary to the remarks from my friend from Dulwich and West Norwood. The idea that we could tonight vote for a general election, have a general election, and come back, and the whole issue of Brexit would be cleanly resolved is a nonsense, an absolute nonsense. Nobody can predict, in this current circumstances, in what would be a general election where only one issue was on the ballot paper, what the result of that election would be. And to subvert a vote on one issue into a general election which should be about our economy, our health, our education system, our environment, and every other issue that is important in the country, isn't a way of dealing with this issue. The only way to deal with this issue is to confirm the decision of the 2016 referendum or not, by the government negotiating a withdrawal agreement with the EU, which the Prime Minister repeatedly tells us he is almost completed, although the Irish Prime Minister today said he had no evidence that it was being progressed. And I'm not sure which Prime Minister I'd like to believe at this stage, but we'll see on the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th of October which one is correct. I will give way, I'll give way.
The honourable gentleman also acknowledged that the Irish Taoiseach also said that if the UK is going to leave, it should do so by the 31st of October, and that was the the viewpoint of the majority of member states within the EU.
Yeah, I think this is an evolving situation on the east side. If we do indeed prorogue tonight without a general election, I'm hoping to go to Brussels tomorrow to meet with a number of people in the European Parliament and the Commission, so I can myself hear firsthand what's happening within the EU, because I think it's very difficult, actually, to have sort of trial by media of what's going on in the EU. It's hard enough to work out what's going on in our own government, never mind in 27 other governments. But just to conclude my point and my speech, the general election isn't an adequate alternative on this question of our future relationship with the European Union. The only real way that we can finally address this, and that people are going to the ballot box and thinking about this issue in isolation, and it would resolve this issue, is, as my honourable friend from ESO said earlier, a confirmatory vote on the question of whether we accept a withdrawal agreement or not, and therefore stay within the European Union. And I think that actually underlying this prorogation are attempts to not allow us the time to have Parliament decide that question. And that is what concerns me, that this is a politicised prorogation of this Parliament.
Martin Whitfield.
Very grateful, Mrs Ryan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and also a pleasure to follow my most honourable friend from Leeds North West. This is an interesting debate funded around petitions that were launched by people who were desperate to try and indicate their view to this House and this government. I represent East Lothian, where 3,867 constituents voted on the petition not to prorogue Parliament, and 86 constituents voted to prorogue Parliament. And it made me think about what prorogation is really about. It dates back to when this House was cleaned to make it ready for the arrival of His or Her Majesty. That's the reason we all had to get out. But the effect of it is much greater than that at a constitutional level. And we've heard about the bills that will have been lost. But let me talk about one small element which comes to mind that causes a problem. I won't be able to lodge any questions on my constituents' behalf when we are prorogued. And I think in particular of an EU citizen who has successfully registered online and has indeed received a letter which has given her a number. And the letter confirms that that is not proof of her status. The only way to gain proof of status is to log on, send a code by mobile phone, get an access code, and then successfully prove. She intends to leave this country on the 1st of November for a holiday. She is worried that she won't get back in. She is worried she won't get back in because when she arrives back with her German passport that won't be read through the data because having departed on the 31st, the data won't transmit or speak to each other. And she's actually genuinely worried that when she tries to get this access, or indeed when Border Force tried to get this access, as has happened before and in some of the trials, nothing happens. What is she supposed to do? So I'm going to pose that unfairly in the hope of an answer, because when we are prorogued later tonight, I won't be able to lodge a question about that. I won't be able to find out on behalf of that constituent what she is supposed to do. And that brings us to the question of the length of this prorogation, where we have had submissions that state, at the end of the day, there is a misnomer over those government ministers who said that they disagreed with prorogation and those that agreed with it. The fact remains that the government has said in their many charts that if you take out conference recess, the number of days that we are being prorogued is not really that much greater than those in the past. Well, that's not true. It is much longer. And the fact remains that this government has not presented the motion for conference recess yet and had no intention to, because I submit, and I believe genuinely, that they were using that period to try and hide what is so successfully, in my opinion, being viewed today, that the government are hiding from being questioned. That's why they want us to go away. They want us to go away so that they don't have to answer questions about data, about medicine, about transport, about EU citizens, about the missing bills, about the state of the environment, about the state of the negotiations. We have to keep this private, I've heard. We can't take no deal off the table. We have to keep our hand secret. It's strange that the European Union seems to have taken entirely the opposite view. Right from the beginning of these negotiations, they have set out the evidence, they have set out their asks, they have debated them, and they've put that in the public realm. And we are unable to do that. We are unable to do that because that's not how you negotiate, we are told. Well, with the greatest of respect, I don't think the way we intend to negotiate, holding our cards close to our chests and telling nobody anything with the 4 people who are left to do the negotiation, is really respecting the United Kingdom and attacking an element of our constitution, prorogation, a relatively small, almost backwater of our constitution. To use this to stop Parliament, to stop the government answering questions that are posed to them by representatives of constituents around the United Kingdom is an extremely dangerous precedent to make. And with all due respect, if we were all sat the opposite way and members of this side were trying to defend the fact they were sending politicians, members of Parliament, away for 5 weeks so that something could happen, those that stood opposite would not be silent on that. Thank you.
David Drew.
Thank you, Mrs Ryan. Delighted to serve under your chairmanship. Can I thank those thousands of people who signed the petition in my constituency of Stroud. And I'll start by saying that I'm angry. Now, I'm a mild-mannered person, as most of you would agree to, but I just think that this is something that I never thought I'd see in this mother of parliaments. And remember, we are the mother of parliaments. We created parliamentary democracy. And parliamentary democracy works because the government runs Parliament. Maybe that sometimes isn't as clear as it should be. But also there is a degree of fair play between government and opposition. And that is completely broken down to the extent that we are now given a whole series of guns to our head. Go for a general election, go for no deal, as if that is what a parliament should accept. Now, if this was some banana republic, we understand the way in which the president might manipulate it. But this is the British Parliament. And this really is a very dark day in terms of the way in which this Parliament operates. Now, I'm reminded of an episode of The Likely Lads. Sorry for all those who are very young here, but there's a wonderful episode of The Likely Lads where they are trying to avoid the result of the England football game. So the whole story, the episode, is they spent the whole day disappearing in and out of pubs because they don't want to know what the score is. And because it's on the recorded highlights, and they just want to watch it as though it was a live game. And, of course, they get to the very last thing, and on a beer mat is written the result of the game. And what it proves to me is you can hide, you can run, but you will always be held to account somewhere. And the government with prorogation feels very much like that at the moment, because prorogation is about trying to avoid being called to account over some of the most important things. Now, you know, I do bear a grudge because I spent 37 hours of my time in the Agriculture Bill as our opposition spokesperson on this side. Other people were with me. No matter how badly I did try my best. And the fact is, those 37 hours I'm never going to get back. Now, I might be fortunate enough to have another 37 hours because the bill will come back, hopefully, in some form. Now, why does this matter? Well, if I'm trying to actually plan out my farm policy, trying to work out what I'm going to grow next year, what animals I'm going to keep, I need to know the system of agriculture. And yet that's in abeyance. Yet, okay, we can carry on with the existing CAP, but I thought we were trying to get out of the CAP. That was one of the drivers for leaving the EU. Now, in terms of that, that's bad enough. But I also spent an awful lot of my hours in statutory instruments, some of which by now will be out of date. Now, it wasn't our decision to have a 2-year parliament. That was at the behest of the government. Some of us feel that that was a mistake and Parliament should have an annual programme. But this government decided it would have a 2-year programme. It's come back to haunt us. The Agriculture Bill left this place well before Christmas of last year. Therefore, we've had the best part of 9 months waiting for it to come back. I understand through the usual channels we were offered a deal. Let it through, and then we won't say anything else about it. Well, with the best one in the world, we did have some arguments against the bill in its current form. That's bad enough, but as my honourable friend has said, I think 2 honourable friends have said, fisheries is even more drastic. If we drop out with no deal, The Scarlet Wars that happened over the Christmas period are just a foretaste. People will start taking the law, whatever that may be at this moment in time, into their own hands. If we weren't debating this today, I was supposed to be summing up for the opposition on cages, animal sentience, and so on. Again, all that is in abeyance. We do not have a clear statement. The law doesn't exist anymore. We chose not to put it in the trade bill. We have an animal sentience bill, which is currently, I don't know whether it will be part of the carryover or whether it will be not. Now, does that matter? Well, of course it matters. If you're trying to prosecute someone who's mistreated an animal, what law do they use? Do they use the law that used to exist or the law that could have existed if we'd have allowed it to go through? So these matters, these issues really matter. It's not about us on the opposition side just kicking off. It's about the way in which we are being precluded from doing our job. Now, again, I just think, and I would have raised this as a point of order, I'm now getting through from various departments, and I'll mention them, DEFRA, the department I shadow, DCMS, and the FCO. I'm now being told that parliamentary questions cannot be answered because of the prorogation of Parliament. Now, I put these questions in over the recess. One of the great things that Speaker Burker, we could all go on about how wonderful he's been and so on, but one of the great things he did put in place is you could ask questions that were answered over the recess. I thought that was a dramatic improvement of not being able to do the job we're supposed to do by holding the government to account. I've now got 3 departments telling me, in advance of prorogation, anything could happen. We could choose not to prorogue tonight. And yet these departments are told we're not going to answer. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to answer in the future. It means they're not going to answer. The questions go down. That is wrong. It's wrong for me because I've got to put them all in again. But other departments have answered. So will the government, through the minister, put on the record what is the process when you're about to prorogue of whether departments answer a question? Dare I say, some civil servants seem to work very hard to get you an answer. Other civil servants just say, well, here's a 2-line thing, we're not going to answer it. To me, a lot of this is the way in which Parliament isn't really running by the rules anymore. I mean, the idea is that Parliament holds the government to account. At the present time, it seems Parliament is held to account by this government, and we're used as a sort of, well, we'll answer when we want to, we'll let you take in part in debates if you have to, but really this is subject to our whims. My friend Graham Allen, when he chaired the Constitution Committee, when we had one, the Select Committee, looked at this thing, should we have a written constitution? I feel very strongly on the last couple of weeks, we must have a written constitution. It is wrong that Parliament cannot actually hold the government to account. We should have rules on when prorogation takes place. We should have rules on what happens when departments answer questions or not. This really matters because it's about the way in which we as parliamentarians, whatever party we come from, and whether we're in the government or the opposition, we have to have the security and knowledge that the job we're doing is one that cannot be undermined. Otherwise, we talk about this Parliament losing the confidence of the people. They will lose confidence increasingly because they think that really the government just rubber stamps whatever it wants. And that is in a time of a hung Parliament, and this government is a very hung government for all sorts of reasons we know about. So it's important that we have this justification of what is going on, and that is put into some form of arrangement so that the rules are much more transparent, open and fair. Because I think what is going on is undemocratic, it's unconstitutional, given that we've not got a written constitution. It's a mess, because I think you try and explain to your constituents what we're all up to at the moment. It is not easy. My emails, sometimes I think, do I understand what I'm writing? Because it changes from minute to minute, and it is very unclear what our stance is, whether we're government, opposition, or whatever. And I do think, deep down, this is a shameful period in our Parliament, and we should actually be doing something about it.
Anna McLaurin.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ryan, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And can I also thank the thousands in my constituency of Cardiff North who signed the petition to defend democracy and against this prorogation. It is certainly not in keeping with this, and it's not in the spirit of our values as an open, free and transparent parliamentary democracy. Although when I talk about transparency in this instance, it's not hard for anyone to see the motive behind the Prime Minister. It's a blatant act of trickery by the Prime Minister and those around him in number 10, designed not only to shield a weak and divided government from the wave of dissatisfaction among members of Parliament across this House, as well as homes across the country. And it is a disingenuous act. This Prime Minister makes as much fanfare of our parliamentary democracy, as well as lauding historic figures who led our country through past emergencies. But whilst he might try and compare himself to those who held the highest office before him and draw comparisons between their strife and his own, the situation we find ourselves in now is entirely of his own making. And indeed, his attempt to subvert democracy in this way is not at all fitting of those comparisons to any of the figures that he holds in such high esteem, or indeed the office of Prime Minister. And we know that these events that we've seen in the last days and weeks have stretched the capacity of our constitutional norms. But what have they taught us? A Prime Minister that is prepared to flout the limits, to stretch those limits of democracy and abuse the parliamentary system. And I think, actually, that urgent reform is needed. I would agree with my colleagues that have gone before me. Urgent reform is needed, and that is a debate perhaps not for today, but for another day. But in kicking out, the Prime Minister, in kicking out those MPs, in dismissing them out of his party and locking the door by suspending Parliament, he is also denying my constituents in Cardiff North the right for their voice to be heard. And in silencing the voice of MPs, he is silencing a nation too. And people and businesses in Cardiff North, they all tell me this. They came up to me at the weekend. They want to know what is going on. Why is the Prime Minister doing this to our country? Why is this government doing this? They're worried about their future and how this impacts them. They are worried about the path to no deal, the path to a really devastating no deal, which could take them on a path and their livelihoods, their families, all impacted. And all this takes place in the eye of the storm amidst this growing emergency, this national crisis, where people actually, they expect us to be present here. They want us to be here, standing up for them, working hard to resolve this crisis. And by suspending Parliament, as has been said before me, that means the bills, they fall by the wayside. Those important bills that have been talked about, that we've all worked hard on. The Environment Bill that's already been mentioned, the Agricultural Bill that's already been mentioned. I have my own bill that will fall by the wayside. That's on plastics and packaging, extending the producer's right, responsibility, extending that responsibility to make sure that the packaging that they produce is far more environmentally friendly, to make them stand up and take notice. But that falls by the wayside. What will happen then? I've just come from a meeting with climate protesters who are here in Parliament meeting their members of Parliament. There were tens, if not hundreds of them there today. What does the message suspending Parliament send to the country, send to the world? What, that we don't care about the climate emergency? I'm afraid the climate emergency does not stop just because Boris Johnson wants to massage his own ego and get on with crashing us out of a no deal. Apologies, Mrs. Ryan. I'll use the word Prime Minister from now on. So, but I'll give way.
For the Honourable Lady giving way, if she's referring to the event in the Churchill Room, that's actually the Climate Extinction, the Extinction Rebellion Sutton group that have organised it, hosted by me, which is why I had to come over here. But there's perfectly ability to go and meet these people, as I did in organising it, in my constituency and bringing that back over a period of time, so we can still do our work, not just here.
She wishes to use the phrase "the right honourable member for Uxbridge." That will also be perfectly accepted.
She might prefer Prime Minister.
I thank you. Yes, thank you very much,
Anna McMorran.
Mrs. Ryan. Thank you. I thank the member for his intervention there, and absolutely, my job, and has been all summer, and whenever this place is in recess, is working on all of those issues, as we all do in our constituencies. But do you know, stopping Parliament from sitting means we stop that vital legislation. It means we stop scrutinising the government on what action they are taking on this climate emergency. And we need action. It's all very well to have words, but we need action on this. And that needs to be at the highest level. I'm afraid, well, OK, if he wants to give way.
The Honourable Lady, she's been very generous. Does she agree with me that we didn't hear a lot of that call for action and scrutiny about all of these other issues over the summer recess, when we could have been talking about any number of things?
Anna McMorran.
I thank the member for his intervention. I don't really understand it, because Parliament wasn't sitting. We all called for that during the summer. I met with my own protesters in my own constituency. I've also held various events in my own constituency through recess. But anyway, I will continue. And this is exactly why I will not stand idly by whilst our country is run roughshod over by a Prime Minister in freefall. A Prime Minister who will now use this time to roam the country, electioneering using public money. And prorogation, suspension or not, his attempts to silence us will not work. And I am here to protect the livelihoods, the futures, the businesses of my constituents. With a threat as big as no deal looms large, with the government choosing ruin over delay, I will continue to do whatever I can by joining forces with my colleagues to protect those vital jobs, services, communities and livelihoods. And I will continue to campaign and to fight for what I personally believe is the best solution to this crisis we find ourselves in. And that is putting this decision back to the people for a final say over the future of Brexit. And I will be campaigning firmly and loudly to remain as a full member of the European Union.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Ryan, and I do apologise for not being here at the beginning of the debate. I was giving evidence to the review committee on HS2, and that is one of the reasons why I'm very concerned about the... that's one of the reasons why I'm very concerned about the length of this prorogation, because HS2, Phase 2A, which is being debated in Parliament at the moment, is now approaching the House of Lords, has huge impact on my constituents. So it was important to be able to give evidence to this review committee. And I will come on to the other things that we're being prevented from doing over the coming weeks by, I won't say the prorogation, but the excessive prorogation, because it's absolutely right we should have a prorogation. It's right that we should have a new Queen's speech, and I'm fully in favour of that. What is not right is that it should have been until the 14th of October. And the plea I will make to the government is that we should come back at the latest on the 7th of October, if not the 3rd of October, which would be after all party conferences have been concluded, and that is plenty of time. The first reason for this is that we are in the midst of a crisis in Parliament and indeed in the country. I believe that we need to respect the result of the referendum in 2016 and leave the European Union, but leave it with a deal in an orderly way in the manner in which the manifesto on which I stood in 2017 set out. And the problem with prorogation coming back on the 14th of October is that leaves less and less time for the alternative deal, the new deal or revised deal, which I firmly hope the Prime Minister will bring back to the Parliament to be considered, even in advance, perhaps if it's draft, of the European Council on the 17th of October. And I think it's our responsibility to look at that. Indeed, I will be, as a member of this newly formed grouping of MPs for a deal, I will be working with members of Parliament across the House to ensure that there is an opportunity to arrive at a deal which achieves a majority in this House. Of course.
Like him, I was giving evidence HS2 and meeting Extinction Rebellion and indeed meeting Dignity in Dying and Shelter. So I do wonder why it can be said that we have very little to do here as we're trying to be in 5 places at once. I admire what he said in relation to prorogation. Would he go say further than that, say at least we remain members of Parliament and at least we can still lobby and at least we can come back sometime in October. Had an election gone ahead, we would have had no control over that whatsoever. And with a Prime Minister who has said he may be equivocal about obeying the law, that's the thing to be avoided at all costs.
Yes, I very much understand, and we were together in the HS2 committee, and I listened very carefully to what he said, and I think very important points made about I think it was Old Oak Common and the area around there, which or the part of London which is affected by HS2. I'm in a quandary over the issue of an election. I think, on the one hand, an election would be decisive. It would give the chance either, as I suspect it will be run pretty much on Remain, Leave, or Leave with a deal lines. It will be a chance for the people to decide in a manner of speaking. But on the other hand, I do very much see what he says, that if we don't have, if we have an election, we are not able to raise these points anyway. But what we're left with is a kind of halfway house. So we're not able to raise points in Parliament because we've been prorogued. And on the other hand, we haven't got the decision, the decisiveness of an election. So it's neither fish nor fowl. As I said, there were 2 main reasons why I don't want to see Parliament prorogued for as long as it is, and there is still a chance for the government to request that prorogation not be for as long as it is at the moment. The first is so that we have more time to consider really important matters, such as the prospective deal, which I very much hope that the Prime Minister is committed to bringing before this House, and which I hope in some form or other will be passed by this House so that we can fulfil the result of the referendum and leave in an orderly fashion. But it is also extremely important to bring up constituency matters. And with your permission, Mrs. Mayne, I'm just going to give 2 or 3 examples because I'm not going to be able to bring these up at leaders' questions or in other opportunities. The first is a constituent of mine, Staff Sergeant Proverbs, who has just left the army after 20 years of service. He was injured on duty at a NATO headquarters in this country, and yet, because of the intricacies of the rules around pensions, around disability, he is being deprived, after 20 years of service to this country, having seen active service in a number of theatres, of a proper disability payment and disability pension. I've taken this up with the Armed Forces Minister, I've taken it up with the Veterans Minister, and I've had a sympathetic hearing, but it seems to me that the Ministry of Defence is not dealing with my constituent in a proper manner, and as a result, he is going to face a much lower level of income despite his disability, which was incurred in the course of serving our country. And again, I would raise the case of my constituent, Mr. Gray, who has on whose behalf I've written to Barclays a number of times. I've raised it before in the House of Commons, and yet Barclays, the latest time, still have not replied to me on a very serious matter. Just a request for a meeting. They have not come back to me. I also want to raise, Mrs. Mayne, the fact that I had a debate not too long ago on the manipulation of precious metal prices, a very serious matter, fundamental to the financial system, not just of this country, but of the whole world. Now, we had a good response from the Minister, but there are very serious outstanding matters which need to be raised in Parliament and need to be discussed here. I could go on, and I'm sure other members could do the same. However, it is quite clear to me that we need the time in Parliament. Clearly, the government needs time to prepare the Queen's speech. That I understand. But a couple of weeks is more than enough. It's not as if they're starting on it ab initio. It's not as if, as from tomorrow, they will start thinking about the Queen's speech. They have been doing so for a very long time, and rightly so. 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum is more than enough. So let's, I would urge my honourable friend, the Minister, to communicate to his colleagues in government and to the Prime Minister that it would be an act which I think would be welcomed across the House if we could resume on the 3rd of October or at the very latest the 7th of October.
Shepherd.
Thank you, Mrs. Mayne, and a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'd like to begin just with a couple of points about the procedure that we're engaged in here today. And I say this before they leap up with no criticism intended or implied of members of the Petitions Committee. But I have been at a number of these debates now where the public have petitioned us, and I really do wonder whether our procedures are effective and robust enough in terms of delivering on the expectations that those who petition Parliament might have. And I think two things are of note here. One is that we are dealing with two petitions. I'm not sure of this need to lump together petitions from the public just because they cover the same topic, particularly in this instance, as they are of diametrically opposed views. And also one petition, which I presume has been organised by pro-Brexit campaigners, presumably because they feel this Parliament to be made up of Ramoners who are antipathetic to their case. It has taken 5 months for them to gather the requisite threshold of 100,000 signatures to be presented before Parliament, whereas the other, with 1.7 million signatures, was collected in a matter of hours and represents a very serious public outrage to a decision that has been taken by the government. And I think to have parity of consideration of those two things is simply not fair. But the other thing is, and I wonder, Chair, whether those who sign the petitions to this place, how many of them understand that this is the place where their hopes and aspirations come to die. On a wet Monday afternoon in a committee room off the House of Commons chamber with 10 of us assembled with no ability to advocate on behalf of the petitioners, no ability to influence, never mind change government policy. And I do think it's too late for this Parliament, but I do think in the future, if I come back to this place, I'm going to be seeking changes to our procedures and how we deal with those who petition this Parliament, because I don't think we treat them fairly enough. But my concerns about the procedures as to how we deal with petitions are as nothing compared to my concerns about the inadequacy of our Constitution in these current circumstances when it comes to the very sitting of Parliament itself. It is astonishing, is it not, that our Parliament can be suspended for 5 weeks in the middle of a major political crisis whose ramifications are profound and legion, which is in no way near to being concluded. I think most people would find that astounding. I find it astounding myself that this can happen perfectly legally and perfectly normally. The role of Parliament is to scrutinise and hold to account the executive. And it cannot be right that the executive can relieve itself of that scrutiny by the simple expedient of suspending Parliament. This seems to be a bizarre situation, yet this is the one that we are confronted by. And it will mean that the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, who is our current Prime Minister, by the time we get to October the 14th, he will have been in power, the most powerful executive office in the land, for 82 days, and in only 4 of those days will this Parliament have been able to hold him and his government to his account. And that is, frankly, a shocking state of affairs. And I don't buy the argument, frankly, that this is because the government ministers and their advisers need time to prepare a new legislative programme. I'd be happy to give way.
You just outlined how long the Prime Minister's been in office, 82 days, and the Parliament's only been sitting 4 days. That also means there's only one Prime Minister's questions. So members of this House have not and will not have the ability, until after the Queen's speech, to question the Prime Minister, even though he'll have been in office for well over 3 months by that point.
I know, it's staggering. I think, why is this happening then? I think we need to ask ourselves that. I think it's happening for one reason, which is that we have a Prime Minister who has no mandate, who has no majority in the House, no ability to get legislation through the Parliament, and therefore, rather than compromise with the Parliament, rather than seek a majority, he is determined instead simply to walk away from it and to not have the debate in the first place. And I think it's a very bad look for our democracy that this is happening in this way. I think it's also bad that we have a Prime Minister who is uncertain in terms of his public pronouncements as to whether or not he will actually deliver on the will of the Parliament, which is now the law of the land, that we should, in the absence of a withdrawal deal from the European Union, seek an extension to the 31st of January in order to allow further time for a withdrawal agreement to emerge. That the Prime Minister and his advisers are equivocal on that is a matter for deep concern, I believe. And I don't buy also the Prime Minister's suggestion that all we need to do then, in these circumstances, is have a quick cut-and-run election. Because there is no point having an election if the main point of that election, i.e. whether or not to crash out of the European Union without a deal, if that is unable to be altered by the outcome of the election. So to simply have an election as a means to escape the obligation that Parliament has placed upon the Prime Minister seems to me something that we cannot allow, and rightly, the Parliament has not, and the Parliament, I'm sure, will not allow that later on tonight. But I say this, I do think an election will need to come soon, and the delay will only be a matter of weeks. And as soon as we are confident that we are not crashing out of the European Union without a deal and have more time to consider options and strategy, then I think it will be, frankly, impossible to advance this process in the country without going back to the people. It is time for them to have another say, because one of the things I sense is that an awful lot of members of this Parliament, on both sides of the House, understand very well the consequences of Brexit, and they are not attracted to them. But they feel they do not have a mandate to oppose it because of the nature of the manifesto on which they stood on 2017. And therefore, to shake up the political cards and to allow a different Parliament to emerge with fresh mandates may open the possibility for a reconsideration of this. And I do hope that an election will allow a new Parliament to consider putting this matter back to the people who started the process in the first place. Because it is not the role of Parliament to overturn or set aside or ignore the will of the people, but it is the role of Parliament to interpret it. And if in this case we have found 3 years later that what the people have asked us to do is simply undoable, that is to leave the European Union and make things better, it cannot be done. That circle cannot be squared, and we need to go back to the people and explain that that is the case, and ask them if they want to reconsider. Now, it may well be that they do not want to reconsider. It may well be that they are content to leave the European Union knowing that it will impoverish them and their families and diminish the character and culture of this country. But that choice should be for them, and they should be allowed to make it. But I am confident that if we are given the opportunity to fight that election, then we can get an alternative point of view emerged, which will actually look at the benefits of remaining in the European Union and changing it so that it delivers for the people's aspirations. And I say this in conclusion, that when that election comes in Scotland, we shall be campaigning in my party, not just to say, stop and reconsider the process of Brexit, not just to get an alternative government to the one we have had for nearly a decade now, but also to demand and assert the right of the people in Scotland to choose an alternative future should they so wish. And it should be their right not to go down the path that they are led by the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge, but to say that they wish to consider an alternative independent future where they take political control of their own affairs and determine their own relationship with the rest of the people in Britain and in Europe. That is the manifesto that we will be putting before people in the election, which I'm sure will come in November, and I look forward to coming back to argue that case in this chamber.
Mrs Maynard, and it's an honour to serve under your chair. And Mrs Maynard, can I take this opportunity to thank all contributions from all members, which highlight the seriousness of this debate. So at this most crucial time in our country's recent history, Parliament is tonight to be suspended for up to 5 weeks. This slippery manoeuvre by the new Prime Minister is designed to scupper proper accountability and silence scrutiny at a time when it is most needed. The current government is already operating with even more secrecy than the previous government, which was certainly not known for its transparency. And as we saw last week when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster came to the House to provide an update on Brexit preparations, this government is determined to conceal what is really going on. So indeed, what we know about the government's preparations for Brexit has come mostly from leaks and insights from former Tories, including the former Work and Pensions Secretary, who resigned in protest at the inaction at this weekend. So according to newspaper reports, the Yellow Hammer papers, which outline scenarios in the event of a no-deal Brexit, speak of delays at the Channel stretching over 2 days, food and medical shortages, and potentially even protests on the street. And when it comes to the government's negotiations with Brussels, depending on who you listen to, they are either going well or they're going nowhere at all. And I suspect the Minister doesn't even know himself. Such is the way his government is run, by a small ring of unelected advisers who are more concerned with their reputations than the interests of the country. Clearly then, there are serious questions that Parliament and the public need answers to over the coming weeks. But in closing down Parliament, the Prime Minister has denied the chance for questions to be asked, let alone answered. And as we have heard from honourable friends who have rightly pointed this out, he has shown contempt not only for parliamentary democracy, but for the British public, who deserve reassurances that the government has their interests front and centre. It is yet another case of the old Etonian, entitled arrogance that seems to characterise so much of this government's policies. And what it really boils down to is the sense among the Prime Minister and his allies that they know best. Well, clearly they do not. And every time the Prime Minister loses yet another vote in the Commons, we are reminded that far from knowing best, they have misjudged Parliament. And we in Labour believe they have also misjudged the mood of the public. If they use the suspension of Parliament to ram through a no-deal Brexit, as many believe they will not be delivering on the will of the people, but rather setting this country up for a period of more stagnation and hardship. We must expose no deal for what it is. It's not a quick fix to solve Brexit, but a path of more chaos, more negotiations, more unrest, and no consensus across the country. Far from settling the chaos, it will take us back years whilst we build the economic relationship from scratch that we want with our closest and nearest trading partners. It would be a path of more delay rather than forging our future relationship with the EU. We would see years of turmoil that we simply cannot afford. And after a decade of Conservative austerity, this is the exact opposite of what our country needs at this key turning point. This is why Labour is determined to use every possible means to expose and prevent a no-deal Brexit, which has only ever been the desired option of a small group of hardliners within the Conservative Party, obsessed with deregulation and mythical free trade deals. Indeed, it's their obsession with a no-deal Brexit and the failure of successive Prime Ministers to show leadership that has stopped us from reaching a consensus and getting a deal that works for the whole country. The Chancellor's repeated refusal to rule out an electoral pact with the Brexit Party only confirms that this government is prepared to hang on to the coattails for hardliners just like the last one. But set aside the question of Brexit for the moment and consider the shock with which so many of the public reacted to the news, not only that the Prime Minister was closing down Parliament, but the very fact that he could do that. For many people, the last few weeks have provided a crash course in how the British Constitution works. And we hear that Parliament TV overtook Love Island in the viewing ratings. I think on both programmes, all viewers probably unhappy with the characters that are taking part. While people often talk in glowing terms of our unwritten constitution as being flexible, this flexibility has allowed the Prime Minister to sidestep Parliament completely. So consider the precedent this sets for a moment. A Prime Minister who doesn't like the view of Parliament simply shutting it down and silencing the elected representatives. In doing so, he has shown contempt for democracy, but has also revealed just how archaic our political system really is. Brexit is about many things, but for many people, it was a chance to express their dissatisfaction with how our political system works, and they are right to be dissatisfied. Our Westminster system is over-centralised, our second chamber unelected. Parliament is dominated by those from privileged backgrounds, and our elections are captured by big and dark money. The ability of the Prime Minister to so easily suspend Parliament is yet another feature of our political system that points towards the urgent need for reform. And that's why the Labour Party is committed to delivering a constitutional convention when in government, to examine and advise on reforming the way Britain works at a fundamental level. We hope that the convention will provide the impetus behind a programme of democratic reform that puts power in the hands of people. But in the meantime, it's absolutely essential that the Labour Party, working with the opposition parties, does everything it can to prevent a disastrous no deal. The suspension of Parliament will make this task all the more difficult. But as the last week has shown, the government's tricks and attempts to rig the system are collapsing like a house of cards. And if they continue to show contempt for Parliament and the British public, they may find themselves leaving number 10 as quickly as they entered it.
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mrs Mayne. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'll thank the Honourable Member for Sutton and Cheam for opening the debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee and for speaking to the petitions before us today, which more than 1.7 million people have signed. I have to say it's been quite an interesting debate. I've enjoyed sitting here, listening to all of it, and I've heard many passionate speeches with statements about not wanting to silence voters, that there is no mandate and no majority, that the government doesn't have a mandate, that voters are being silenced. Well, if people have those concerns, there's an opportunity to do something about that later this evening, and that's to have a general election and ask the country and the electorate to make the decision about who they wish to govern this country. And I think it's somewhat telling that it's the opposition who are likely to block that. Although I do hope from some of the speeches we've heard today that the members sat opposite will be getting into that eye lobby this evening to vote for a general election and to vote for their constituents, to have the loudest say of all, their vote in a general election. But briefly, and then I'll answer the honourable gentleman's other question.
I'm very grateful for this indication that you're seeking debate. On the off chance that the vote tonight should be unsuccessful, would you then consider revoking the prorogation motion so that we can have the debate here?
Thank you, Mrs Main. No, the reasons have been set out for the prorogation, but I think it has to be said that the arguments, those who've been shouting about stop the coup and defend democracy, who then don't want to have a general election, I can't think of any example of a coup in history where a free and fair general election has been offered immediately afterwards, and I think it's absolute nonsense. But coming on to the more serious question the Honourable Member for East Lothian asked was about what would happen. He decided to raise a bit of a scare story about what will happen for an EU citizen coming to our border on the 1st of November. Luckily, he can visit the government website. Being promoted out, you can certainly have a good read of it afterwards. And there's a section, crossing the border after Brexit. There's also another section on EU citizens moving to the UK after Brexit, which would have answered his question. But he'd be pleased to know that as they come across the border on the 1st of November, the example they gave, nothing will change. Still be able to use e-gates if they're travelling on a biometric passport and will not face routine intentions testing. And it also goes on to say that if those coming here between the 31st of October and the 31st of December next year will be able to move to the UK and live, study, work and access benefits and services as they do now. So bluntly, a simple Google would have revealed all those interesting information. And certainly I'd encourage people who have got queries to look on that website. But it has been pointed out in the debate that these petitions are clearly distinct from one another in their ask of the government. The first one from March 2019 calls on the government to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament. The second, which was launched last month, calls on the government not to prorogue or dissolve Parliament unless and until the government either revokes Article 50 or seeks a further extension. Like so much in Brexit, this makes it a debate where you cannot please everyone. In responding to these petitions, I shall begin by setting out the process for proroguing Parliament before turning to the specifics of the points made in these petitions. Certainly.
Could I just only point out that there might be a way to please everyone, which is to prorogue for a shorter time, as I've suggested, for 2 or 3 weeks, which will be in accordance with previous precedent, and allow the Queen's speech to be prepared, and at the same time, members to have more time to discuss all those matters, in addition to the international crises which may occur during this time. We're talking about more than 5 weeks here.
Thank you, Mrs Main. I always have great respect for the Honourable Member for Stafford, but the government has set out the period of prorogation. It's set out the reasons for it, set out the Queen's speech, and I can certainly reassure people that we will still be sitting for 3 weeks before the scheduled exit date. And as we've seen over recent days, it doesn't take long if the House is minded to pass these particular pieces of legislation. There will still be ample and adequate time to debate Brexit, and as many would reflect on, we've certainly not been short of opportunities to do that over the last year. Briefly.
Thank the Minister for giving way. I wonder if he could indicate how many days the government intend to schedule for debate if the withdrawal agreement bill, assuming we have one.
Thank you, Mrs Main. Of course, any discussion about these number of days will be a matter for usual channels if a deal is agreed. And unlike the member for Stafford, of course, the honourable member opposite likes to shout about no to no deal, but regularly voted no to a deal earlier this year. But in terms of moving on to what prorogation actually is, prorogation is the normal end to a parliamentary session. It remains a matter for the Prime Minister to advise the Sovereign on, as it is a prerogative power. This has not changed from when a party opposite was in government. It is for the government to determine the length of a parliamentary session and to advise the Queen on the date for the state opening of Parliament. The state opening is marked by the Queen's speech, which sets out the programme of legislation the government intends to pursue in the forthcoming parliamentary session. Normally, each parliamentary session runs for a period of 12 months before Parliament is prorogued. The current parliamentary session is an exception to the ordinary 12 months, as was touched on in the debate, with the last state opening of Parliament taking place over 2 years ago on the 21st of June 2017. This has actually been the longest parliamentary session for almost 400 years, far in excess of any of the others. Very briefly.
Very briefly, why does it take 5 weeks?
Well, as we said, the government has
the Prime Minister set out in his statement on 2nd of September 2019 the many reasons why we want to have the Queen's speech and on the date that we'll be having it. The government's committed to recruiting another 20,000 police officers, improving both NHS and schools funding, and completing 20 new hospital upgrades. It is to progress the government's agenda on these and many other fronts that the Prime Minister sought to commence a new session of Parliament with a Queen's speech on the 14th of October. And as I've touched on already, if members opposite are confident of their arguments, they'd have the chance tonight to actually take that debate out to the whole country and to go and face their constituents and explain the position they have on this subject. If many of them are thinking of voting no this evening, they'll be rather interesting to contrast to the kind on thing. I won't give way for now and make progress. Because interestingly, senior opposition MPs have actually been calling for a Queen's speech. The Shadow Leader of the House has called for a new session and a Queen's speech 5 times in 5 months, while the Shadow Chancellor called for a new session back in May. As we said, the government wants to bring forward a strong domestic legislative agenda, and ending the parliamentary session bringing forward a Queen's speech is the legal and necessary way of delivering this. It's worth pointing out, though, that the largest petition asks Parliament is not dissolved. Parliament, of course, is only dissolved before a general election. The effect of a dissolution is all business comes to an end, and every seat in the House of Commons is vacated until the general election is held. The Prime Minister has been clear that an election should take place ahead of the European Council on the 17th to the 18th of October. This would allow the Prime Minister elected by the British people, either the member for Uxbridge or the member for Islington North, to go to that European Council and for Parliament, a newly elected Parliament, to be in a position to consider what is agreed and hopefully pass the withdrawal agreement bill. Colleagues will, as I've referred to several times, be aware there's a motion for an early general election to be debated later today. They have that opportunity to give a voice to their constituents who they keep on claiming in this debate we're going to be silent. Give them that most powerful voice you have in this country, your vote in a general election. And I look forward to seeing many of them in the I lobby. And as I say, I really hope that if anyone wouldn't have been in some ways making contradictory arguments to shout about defending democracy and stopping a coup and then voting no to the biggest exercise of democracy that you can have in this country, a general election. The government's position remains clear. We will not revoke Article 50 or seek a further pointless extension. The UK will be leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. And I would point out to some members opposite that there is no automatic right to extensions. An extension isn't a solution in itself. It just merely, after 3 years, merely kicking the can is not going to actually solve this issue. 17.4 million people voting to leave the EU is the largest mandate ever given for any UK government to deliver. Both main parties pledged to respect the result in the election in 2017, and now we must deliver on that pledge. The Prime Minister does believe Parliament must have time to consider further the UK's withdrawal from the European Union and to hold the government to account. Parliament has sat ahead of the European Council and will be sitting for 3 weeks prior to exit day. This means there'll be ample time to debate the UK leaving the EU in the coming weeks on both sides of the summit on the 17th of October, ideally with a mandate from the British people to finally resolve this matter. The government would prefer to leave the EU with a deal, and we are working in an energetic and determined way to achieve this. The government is very willing to sit down with the Commission and EU member states to talk about what needs to be done to achieve that. If it is not possible to reach a deal, we will have to leave with no deal. The government is preparing for this outcome, and further delay will only increase the sense of distrust many in the public feel and further increase the uncertainty that is so damaging to our economy. We do take note of all the points raised in the debate today, but the decision to prorogue Parliament is one for the government because prorogation is a prerogative action of the Crown, exercised on the advice of ministers. Therefore, in responding to both of these petitions, I must be clear it's for the government to determine when is the appropriate time to bring out an end to a parliamentary session and bring forward a Queen's speech. The Queen's speech and the debate that follows is one of the great set pieces of the parliamentary calendar, where the government is rightly scrutinised and held to account. The decision is one for the government of the day to make, as it always has been. We have set out our reasons for doing so to ensure a fresh, new domestic legislative agenda is put before Parliament. As I say, Mrs May, there are those who in recent weeks have claimed they wanted to stop a coup, wanted to defend democracy, and that they wanted to give people a say. Well, tonight they've got just the chance to do that and to give the electorate a chance to pass their own judgment. If they don't, many voters across this country will conclude that those comments were as hollow as their pledges to respect the people's vote of the referendum in 2016.
Paul Scully to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs May. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the second half of this debate, and I thank colleagues for their contributions throughout this debate. The Taoiseach earlier on today, after the meeting with our Prime Minister, said if it comes to a request for an extension, I think the vast majority of countries around the table would prefer that there not be an extension. We would like to see this dealt with. If the UK is leaving, it should leave on 31st of October. And this debate has been brought into pretty well every other debate that we've had over the last 3 years. It's boiled down to Brexit. And it's what we're asking for by moving the Ben Bill, by not proroguing Parliament, by not having a general election. We failed for the last 3 years. There's too many people in this place that have caused failure as a Parliament, and we're continuing to fail. We're voting to continue to fail because there's no clear plan as to what would be achieved by simply kicking it into the long grass to the 31st of January. And that's not good enough for the vast majority of people in this country. We've seen quotes being used out of context in terms of why a prorogation is not a good idea, because if prorogation wouldn't be a good idea if it was to kick beyond the 31st October. This is not the case in this side, in this example. We've talked about debating other issues and the lack of ability to debate other issues, but I didn't hear this. I didn't hear recesses asking to be cancelled by members of this House when it affected their holidays in the Easter, when it affected other recesses, periods that we were not sitting in this House. There are always events around the world, as unfortunate as they are, that are going around that we could discuss, that we could debate, and we can raise them in a variety of ways, or we can stop them up to sit, or we could recall. I think I've only got 2 minutes, actually, if you don't mind. But the no deal that people have been talking about is a default option, or is the default option in terms of Article 50, but it's not the default option of this government, as we've been hearing. And it's really important that we retain that in our minds, because there are simple ways of actually dealing with avoiding no deal as far as we're concerned. We could have voted for the withdrawal agreement, which members opposite did not do, or we can now vote for an election to try and unlock the situation ahead of the date of 31st of October, so it can be someone else that is going to Brussels to ask for that extension that everybody of the other side wants. But actually, the reason that the October the 14th has been determined is because we want to set out our domestic agenda. We want to set out our ambitions for apart from Brexit, over the next 12 months, and that's so important that we do so. That's what members of the public are crying out for. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 269157 and e-petition 237487 relating to the prorogation of Parliament. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. My opinion as to which side of the majority has been challenged under the paragraph 13 of Standing Order number 10. The question is therefore not decided and shall be reported to the House. It's possible for the question subsequently to be put to the House for decision without further debate. Order, order.